comic fans. This is Bam Pow Comic Hour with your host Andrew Galaner and Chris Ramos.
I think I'm supposed to say my name.
Well, you know what?
And Chris Ramos. There you
go. Today we're going to talk about the Amazing Spider-Man, the first Omnibus. This collects Amazing Fantasy 15, and it continues all the way through Amazing Spider-Man number 38. This collects the years from 1962 to 1966.
Now we're going to put a little link in the comments section or a link on the post here, just so you can see where you can pick up your own Omnibus collection. We were just talking about the point of an omnibus is to collect a series or a run by a certain artist or a certain writer and just try to take their entire sort of, legacy that they worked on and put it in a oftentimes giant book.
Yes.
And make it accessible for people nowadays to read about those characters without trying to buy each comic issue or piece together trade paperbacks or other collected editions. They remaster each issue and they put it on glossy paper or just some nice high quality colored paper. And then they just say, this is the collection. So the Amazing Spider-Man Omnibus Volume 1 is often referred to as the Steve Ditko years, which is when, of course, Steve Ditko and Stan Lee started Spider-Man back in August of 1962.
Yes, the legend was born.
Now we're going to at least talk a little bit about the first issue. Andrew is well-read in Steve Ditko, and we also want to sort of drum up excitement for the omnibus community and drum up excitement for people to start collecting hardcover volumes of comics because it is a really great hobby to have, and they've really, really drummed up the collected editions in the comic industry. As many things are changing in every industry, we want to just support the comics and make sure that when they go through the trouble of remastering and recoloring and collecting, that there are fans out there looking for that.
Yes. What I love about these is it's all in chronological order by the artist or just the run itself. Most times it's in chronological order. You're not missing an issue most of the time, 90% of the time. And that it's, all the artwork's redone. A lot of these issues, especially Amazing Fantasy or any of these early issues, you'll only see on display. And you'll never be able to read those unless maybe by chance it gets printed in a trade paperback or a hardcover of a smaller release. But that's hard to come across. So I really enjoyed this. And actually, Chris Ramos got me into collecting these. And so it was really awesome that we were able to actually start up this podcast and kind of continue the legacy and share the legacy that Stanley, and Steve Ditko were able to accomplish. And it's really cool to do that retrospect. And that's why I love the Silver Age.
Yeah, Silver Age. And when you look at how Spider-Man even started, or I guess the big question is, why is Spider-Man important? And back in 1962, the only other comic books historically at that point were a handful of mixed stories. And then, of course, Fantastic Four and Incredible Hulk, things that Stan Lee finally got the Marvel Comics name to sort of promote and boost sales. So I'm sure at another podcast we'll talk about the Fantastic Four and sort of the history of why they changed comics in the 60s. But the real drum of it all is when you think about comics as a historical basis and superheroes in general, of course, Superman is the first superhero.
Yeah.
Batman closely followed. Then they had Wonder Woman, and you had a sort of a slew of characters that DC Comics really owned the market on.
Mm-hmm.
And then you had Captain America and a few others, but mostly they were built up slowly around World War II. Because in World War II, you were looking for heroes. You wanted
escapism.
Someone. Yeah.
Yep.
And, if you were stuck on the home front or when you were a child at that time, who were you looking for? heroes
Yep.
that were bigger and better and way beyond your imagination.
Yep.
So, of course, someone like Superman, people could look up to at the time because they saw him as everything that could possibly be in a superhero. He did everything right and he had every power. And that really worked well to kind of pull people away from the terribleness of World War II.
Mm-hmm.
And then when Amazing Fantasy was coming out in 1962, Stan Lee sort of flipped the script a little bit because in the 60s, they weren't necessarily looking for characters that were born this way or characters that were from another planet or characters that had like ancient artifacts that gave them powers.
And it's interesting about Amazing Fantasy that it started out as a monster book. And then this was the last issue that they're like, well, it's getting canceled. Let's just throw this idea out. Whatever happens, happens.
Exactly. So Stan Lee got a chance to work with his friend Steve Ditko, and Amazing Fantasy number 15 had 5 stories in the comic, and one of them was a 12-page arc on Spider-Man, a new character. And the greatest thing about Spider-Man, if you want to compare him, as I was just talking about with Superman, is Spider-Man was the first teenage hero. That was mostly the new twist, is that this is a regular teenager. He has, school to worry about. He doesn't fit in.
Everyday problems.
Eventually it morphed into he has bills to pay and he has, girlfriends to figure out, and he wants to buy a car and he wants to, have his independence. But the first part of it was people looking at Spider-Man and saying, I can be that teenager. That could be me. I could have been accidentally bitten by a spider and then superpowers.
Just a thought experiment. Do you think Peter Parker was influenced by Clark Kent?
I think Peter Parker was influenced by the sidekicks of the old superheroes because no one knew what to do with teenagers, and they knew that they had to connect to comics somehow. So, of course, when Batman's sales were kind of waning a little bit, they threw Robin in there. And when Captain America sales were waning a little bit, they threw Bucky in there. And that's sort of the old trope of a sidekick, is that people are like, you are kind of powered, but you can follow this bigger hero and be a sidekick. I think Stan Lee looked at the idea of Spider-Man and said, what if you couldn't tell how old he was because he's covered from head to toe?
Right. You had no idea.
Yep. And what if he was just like you and me? What if he was just a teenager? And that instantly allowed the readers to connect because, it says in here actually about Amazing Fantasy, it used to be called Amazing Adult Fantasy.
Oh.
From issues like 6 through 14. And then people were writing in the comments or the letters column at the time, they'd mail in letters.
Yep.
And they said, please take off adult because I'm 12 years old and I want to buy this comic and it seems really weird to me. So Amazing Fantasy 15 was priced at 12 cents. And I actually looked up, nowadays 12 cents is about $1. So
that's hard to believe because now these days they charge anywhere from minimum $4. They could charge to $10.
Yeah.
Depending how big.
Well, because they know that these aren't just kids buying comics nowadays.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, they have to figure out how to bring in a new demographic. But for $1, so they made them very accessible for children to pick up. And the Amazing Fantasy line was kind of cool because it just was like short stories, little snippets, which kind of brings you to the genius of Steve Ditko and what he did with 12 pages.
Yeah.
So if we just take a moment, Andrew and I have our Omnis in front of us, and the big idea with the first issue, of course, is to give an idea about Spider-Man, and Steve Ditko does a great job of artistically laying out a lot of information in just maybe 1 or 2 pages.
Yes.
He lays out the entire character, and Spider-Man himself is already bitten by a radioactive spider and climbing up a wall on the 3rd page.
Yeah, right. There's so much expression, and he's interacting. He's building up his family with Aunt May and kind of like the people he's surrounding himself with his friends. I mean, it's all there, and kind of like his origin story, kind of how he started like prize fighting and stuff like that, and just kind of doing like world building from like the square up.
See, and that's interesting too, because he realizes he has powers, but what is the first thing he does with them?
Yeah, he does it for money.
Yeah,
because he has to, like, he's living with Aunt May because his parents are gone, and he does it for money. That was one of the highlights, or the shocking things that when I was reading this, I was like, whoa, he's a lot more focused on money than great power comes great responsibility. And that was another thing that I thought was interesting in this first issue was it's not till the end of the first issue, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but that he says, like, he mentions like the great power comes great responsibility.
Yeah. And that's the famous last panel,
And it's not even Uncle Ben.
No.
Uncle Ben's like this. I don't think he's mentioned till later. Or it's very just, Uncle Ben,
Yeah. Side point.
And we're used to pop culture and we watch the movies as he was this life-changing figure for him.
Yeah. And the other thing about reading the beginnings of comics, and that's why I always encourage people to go back to the beginning or as close as they feel comfortable with. Because to be honest, some of the golden age, which is considered, back in the 40s and 50s, some of those comics, they don't translate quite as well. They're not as action-packed or
There's definitely a lot more dialogue heavy.
Yeah, and the artwork is
narration.
Pretty simplistic for the, because at the time they didn't have extensive printing abilities. So I always encourage people, go back to the beginning, read some of those first issues, and, see how far the characters have come, because Spider-Man started as, like Andrew was saying, started for money. Second part of that was Uncle Ben. Of course, we all know the story. Spider-Man decides to put together a costume and pretty much puts on a show, wrestling every night, gets some money, but he has covered himself from head to toe so no one knows who he is. Mostly
just has a mesh mask on and a turtleneck.
Yeah, to protect his own identity, because not that I don't think he was like ashamed of this. I think it was because he knew that they might look at him differently if they said, "Oh, this is
a teenager,
just a kid." Yeah. And so he needed to rise above. He needed to take on another personality, like Batman did. I need to be something more than a human. And
he's just fighting. It says $100 to the man who can stay in the ring 3 minutes with Crusher Hogan. $100. That's all it takes.
$100. So if we think about that first comic was 12 cents.
Yeah.
So if that really was taking place in the 60s, of course, kids would look at that and say, wow, I just spent 12 cents on this comic and he's getting $100 per fight.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's great money for Spider-Man.
Yeah.
But one thing I took away from this was, of course, he's at the station where he's filming his fights. A thief runs by him who has stolen from the station he's working at. Spider-Man lets him run by him because Spider-Man says, "Not my job. You're being pushed around and you can handle it, cops." And Spider-Man heads home. Now, as he gets home, Aunt May and Uncle Ben give him a microscope.
Yep.
Another day or 2 or 3 goes by because it shows all of these newspaper headlines of Spider-Man
from his infamous, ring fights that he was doing prize fighting.
So quite some time has passed from when this thief stole from the station to then Peter Parker's walking home one night, and when he gets home, see, this is where they've changed a lot of it. Uncle Ben has been killed by a burglar. So that thief came to Peter Parker's house, and that's where Uncle Ben died. And of course, Peter Parker is furious.
Yeah, he's torn up. He's like shakes up his whole life.
He goes after the thief, catches him, realizes that he is the same thief that he let go days before. Mm-hmm. And of course, the very last panel is the famous line, and a lean, silent figure slowly fades into the gathering darkness, aware at last that in this world with great power there must also come great responsibility. And that was it. I mean,
yeah, it just fades in and out. Yep. It's kind of weird. So we're talking about Steve Ditko art. Why do you think you put eyes on his mask?
Well, I see that. I wonder if that was sort of a shock, like a way to
express
illustrate.
Emotion.
He put one little dot in as a pupil in the last panel
because he doesn't do it anywhere else. I don't think. Yeah, he doesn't do it anywhere else when he's got the mask on, but just to express that shock value.
Yeah, what else is really cool about this is that the Spider-Man costume hasn't changed in like 60 years.
Yeah, I mean, yes, he's had like alterations to it, completely different costumes, but square one, this is it.
Yeah, the red and blue.
Like maybe he has like these like almost like, is it a cape web? Or how would you describe that?
They're like underarm webs.
Yeah. That's kind of like most artists kind of went away from that, but some people brought it back.
I think Steve Ditko drew those under his arms because he wanted that eerie feeling, and there was no other way to like work in webbing on his body. Because Steve Ditko before this, of course, was an artist who mainly drew horror. And and he drew the Amazing Fantasy before this issue.
Right. And he came up with the design for webbing. I mean, for Spider-Man's webbing, initially.
Yeah, I mean, really kind of cool stuff. And even Peter Parker coming up with his own web shooters,
Yeah.
Great stuff. So that part of that is, again, why we're trying to promote the Omnibus collecting, because there's no way that you would be paging through the original Spider-Man comic. I think they're going for $200,000.
Yeah, you're gonna see it. Yeah, even more probably. And you're gonna see it at a display case at a con. That's where I've seen it.
Yeah,
and you can go like, oh, there it is. That's the original.
I'm sure it's getting up there. I don't think it's broken the million mark. I know Action Comics and Detective Comics. I know those have broken million marks, but Spider-Man's got to be up there because he not alone broke into the whole new mold of teenagers, because see, this is the first teenage superhero. Of course, what team later on did Stan Lee write that is all teenagers? The X-Men and Fantastic Four.
X-Men. Yep.
So
before that, before
starting Spider-Man as a teenager led to other
successes.
Comics being teenagers too. And then if we look at after this, the fan page, there's a fan page in here, and it says, don't worry, we're going to be writing more Amazing Fantasies, and next month's going to be even bigger, and Spider-Man's probably going to be a monthly.
Yep.
Well, they ended Amazing Fantasy right after this,
right.
And he started out with the Amazing Spider-Man #1, by Steve Ditko. So that's where this Omni collects #1, Spider-Man, Amazing Spider-Man #1 through 38.
Yes.
And that's the last issue that Steve Ditko drew for Spider-Man.
And he never came back.
No,
Is that correct?
He never came back. No, not to Spider-Man. He went on and he wrote his own and drew his own comics.
Yeah. He did like Doctor Strange. He had a run on that. And
he went over to DC for a little while, right? The Question.
Yep.
That was a DC thing. So, I mean, a lot of people who are Steve Ditko fans, because they really think that the layout of his pages and the way that your eye travels through panel to panel is, at the time, really groundbreaking. So he was a well-known artist for that, because he drew characters at all angles, and he drew them from top down, and he skewed the camera, and he changed the way that people were interacting with each other, and that was just sort of Steve Ditko's creepiness, Everyone was always.
And I think it's interesting that Kirby didn't do much for this issue or for Spider-Man, because he was doing like everything else.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And you look at Jack Kirby's drawing of Spider-Man, and he's like blocky and weird, and he's like too strong. Like Kirby drew everyone strong.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And maybe Stan Lee just needed someone who was just lean and lanky and spider-like,
Sure.
And of course,
maybe his horror experience helped as well.
Yeah.
His horror background, and oh, it's a Spider-Man.
Yeah, and part of it too, when you start looking through the next few issues, of course, they kind of started laying the groundwork for just about every Spider-Man villain you can think of.
The Hallmark ones.
Yeah, I mean, Amazing Spider-Man #1. Who came out in that one? The Chameleon.
Yep.
Amazing
Yeah,
Spider-Man
that's interesting
#2.
that was the first villain.
Yeah, the very first villain that they
If you
decided
don't
to throw at
count
him.
like Crusher, the Crusher Hogan, this was his first, or the gunman that shot the dude. I mean,
who is your favorite Spider-Man villain?
Spider-Man villain of all time, or in this Omni?
Old school. Omni. This Omni.
Omni.
We're talking
Okay.
this Omni.
So I really liked how they introduced the Green Goblin. That was interesting. I think Doc Ock, though. I think how before you get into Green Goblin, Doc Ock really stands out. He's got a strong personality, and he's really outside the box.
I have always been a Doc Ock fan, and that was my easy answer. That was my answer.
I didn't even know that.
That was mine. That's my guy. The reason why Dr. Octopus is, in my opinion, the best villain is because just like Dr. Doom and a few others, he, in my eyes, was sort of correct in his thinking.
Right.
You know, the way, or like Magneto,
Mm-hmm.
you know, there are certain aspects that you can get behind these characters and you can sympathize. Yeah. Some of the other characters like Scorpion and Sandman and things like that, or the Lizard, they are straight up villains. I mean, there's just no way around it. You know, just like the Joker with Batman. I mean, he's the villain.
Yeah.
There's
no way around it.
You're not mistaking any of that.
But the designs for these villains I think they're top notch.
Yes. Yeah. And I just wonder how much Steve Ditko, I mean, I know Stan Lee liked to write after the artwork was done.
Yes, I've heard that as well.
That's the Marvel method. Sometimes you hear everyone saying, what's the Marvel method mean? Well, what that means is Stan Lee and Steve Ditko would sit down at the beginning of the day, and Stan Lee would say, how about we draw Spider-Man fighting a villain who made mechanical arms as a science experiment, and then they were stuck on him, and now he needs to get them off and find ways to continue his research, but he has no money, so he needs to rob a bank, and Spider-Man stops him. And that was it. That's all that Stan Lee would kind of like lay out.
So basically they would storyboard with each other
in the morning.
Yeah.
And then Steve Ditko would literally go and draw like 12 full pages with no dialogue about this character and that character working their way through to the end. And that's why you see in a lot of these old issues, the villain appears in the beginning, and then what happens at the end?
Then he comes back, or sometimes,
he's done, and that's
done.
it. Yep. And it's like, what are we gonna do tomorrow? Okay, we're gonna make another villain. You know,
right?
So,
and most of these issues, at least from my perspective, he fights the villain, can't beat him. He has to re-strategize. Then he go face the villain again. It might take another issue to do that, but in the beginning, it was fight the villain, hang out with friends, re-strategize, think what we can do better, and then we go fight him again.
Yeah, like change your game plan, because obviously Peter Parker, you got all beat up because you had to go to school and you didn't have a chance to see where the villain was heading to. And
right,
you know, they always tried to mix something in, like just when Spider-Man was about to beat the villain, he was like, "Oh, Aunt May's calling. I gotta go."
Yep. Or Aunt May's health problems, or Aunt May this and that. And it was interesting, that back and forth, because I guess modern comics, you don't see that a lot. They'll just continue the progression. Yeah, it might happen in the beginning. Or he might not even know who the villain is, and then he just kind of works through his way through the story, and then he'll fight the villain. Then, that's like your climax moment, and then he might...
See, but that's kind of cool, because in some of the modern comics, you never see anyone change.
Exactly.
There are superheroes all the time.
Yeah, so seeing that gradual learning as the comic went on and the story goes on.
Like you're a hero, and then you have to go home and change to be like a person.
Yeah.
And then you're a hero again. And
that's how he probably worked all those everyday problems in, is just, he goes fights the villain, he's got to go learn,
Well, see, that's the other magic part of that, is that Peter Parker is not a secret identity. See, no. Peter Parker is a real guy. Yeah. He's a real kid.
Oh, and then what was
he's not
Peter
faking.
Parker's first name, or his name before was Peter Parker?
Oh, did that mistake was?
Yeah,
They did a mistake
remember
in it.
Peter Palmer?
Yeah, Peter Palmer.
Peter Palmer.
That was one that they
Classic Peter Palmer.
mistakenly put in there.
Yeah.
Like, oh, that got past the editor.
Yep.
But yeah, that he is Peter Parker, and there's no faking it. He's not. This isn't Clark Kent. He's faking.
Yep.
He's an actual teenager, and he has to go to school, and he has to do those things. And a lot of the other earlier comics, he gets like a flat tire, and he gets mixed around, and his friends don't want to hang out with him. So
this is all he's all in high school at this point.
yeah, like
he's not driving anywhere.
No.
he's in New York. He's based in New York, so this would be a common thing.
and he has no girlfriend really. In
No.
these first few
I
issues.
think Liz Allen was a love interest, and there was and Betty Brant.
Oh yes, Betty
Those
Brant.
were the two love interests. No Mary Jane. Mary Jane, fun fact, and I can't remember off the top of the head what issue, but she makes like this cameo appearance where you don't even see her face. She just turned back, and
Yeah, there's like a plant in front of her, right?
Yeah.
There's like a flower in
right.
front of her.
It's weird to look back at that retrospect and go, she wasn't even a thing yet.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one of the most famous
Like an idea, maybe.
romances in all of comics,
Right.
of course. And then you realize they went a few years without.
Right.
I mean, this Omni ended with Amazing Spider-Man 38 in July of 1966. So, I mean, they went 4 years
Yeah.
without any kind of real
Right.
solid love interest, but that really allowed them to flesh out the character and make it right, I think, but yeah, so Steve Ditko and Stan Lee, once they kind of laid out the pages and drew everything, then Stan Lee would go in and he would add dialogue based on what the pages looked like and where he thought they were going.
Yeah.
And that was the Marvel method. And so the artists were just left to draw and fill pages. And that's why some of Stan Lee's writing looks a little like
Off.
stale, a little off. Like
Yeah.
he didn't know what to do with this panel. So he's just pretty much like, oh yeah, J. Jonah Jameson is walking to his window and staring out the window. And then it goes to the next panel.
Yep.
You're like, why would you mention that?
Right.
It's because Stan didn't really know what to do with some of the artwork. And just said,
It
well,
would
I
be a
guess it's a
challenge.
filler.
Yeah. It would be a challenge. Like, don't know what I'm doing, kind of pacing. Okay, but I have to get to here.
Yeah.
So how do I get to here?
Aunt May is now knitting. And
Right.
he would literally write all of that out. So you'd be like,
For
yes,
sure.
I understand you're explaining this panel to me.
Yeah.
Of course, some of the other notable introductions are Mysterio,
Yep.
awesome Spider-Man villain, and Sandman,
Yep.
Kraven the Hunter.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just flipping through here, almost every other page you get some notable villain.
Yeah.
But
Another thing that I thought was interesting was how much he hung out with and how much he wanted to be in the beginning to the Fantastic Four. Like early on, like that's like the second issue is him like trying to get into the Fantastic Four, but he fails because like he kind of like scares him a bit, and they think he's like a villain, and so they don't come to this understanding until I think the very end.
yeah, and things like that, they paired up obviously they're trying to build their own Marvel universe at the time, so they paired up everybody and everyone else's comics. Because if you were a Spider-Man fan and he was appearing in Fantastic Four, well, then you might want to go pick up a Fantastic Four. And if you were a Fantastic Four fan and then here Spider-Man is going to visit them, then you grab that comic.
All right.
And that kind of started that crossover comic mentality of like, let's do 10 issues and every issue is a different comic character and a different run, and
Yep.
kind of muddied
And
it
then
up.
he became this like frenemy, mostly best friends with Johnny Storm as the Omni continues. But like they're always like fighting with each other, like like why'd you do that? Like Johnny Storm's like the show off, and Peter Parker is the complete opposite. He's very sheltered almost, and they're trying to meet in the middle with each other, and there's some humility I think Johnny Storm learns, and Peter Parker has to get some experience as Spider-Man and kind of just meet their way in the middle.
Yeah, because I think, the Fantastic Four at that time, they had enough issues under their belt to really call themselves a bona fide comic group. Fantastic Four #1 came out in August of 1961.
Wow. So that was, about a year before.
Yeah. So that was the issue that broke Stan Lee out of the comic industry and,
Wow.
started his path towards superstardom. Once the Fantastic Four hit, him and Jack Kirby both became superstars.
Yeah.
And then fast forward to Spider-Man here, a year or two later. And I think they needed to kind of build up Spider-Man in his own right. So felt like, let's pair him up with the Fantastic Four a little bit, but then let's have them reject him.
Yeah.
Because every part of Peter Parker has been tragedy. I mean, if you really look at the issues and you look at like what is going good for Peter, not much.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's good to see a different dynamic than it was like World's Finest with Superman and Batman.
Yeah. I mean,
So it's
everything
good
they did was
contrast,
right.
right?
Yeah.
Like, yeah, maybe they're influenced by it, but like they still wanted to do their own thing.
Well, like the Fantastic Four, they became so popular because they were Marvel's first family.
Yeah.
I mean, they were literally families, and they bickered and they fought and they argued. And I think in a lot of these panels too, you see Spider-Man kind of act out of character a little bit, like he gets grumpy. And I remember reading, he gets mad, and then he just gets frustrated because he feels like things are finally going right for him, and then all of a sudden they're not.
Yeah, and it could be, maybe things are going right when fighting this villain, but his home life and school life, especially like dealing with Flash Thompson, before they came to like a more mutual understanding, which wouldn't be for a while. Like he would always be this like high school bully that just harps on him all the time.
Right. Yeah, and kind of the big part of that was, he knows the risk of being Spider-Man, but he knows that he can't stop. He tries to kind of not do it, and he sees people suffering. So then you must look at yourself as a reader and as a person and say, if I had the ability to make change and I'm not, am I the villain or am I the hero?
Wow. Yeah,
so
that's a good statement. Yeah,
a
that's a good
big
point.
part of that is, are you standing by and letting wrong happen? Not that Spider-Man searched it out, but he was powered to the point where he could meet that level of villainy. Who else could stop Dr. Octopus? Nobody.
Yep.
At that time. Spider-Man knew he had to rise to that point, and he was gifted with these abilities to do the right thing. And Uncle Ben said, do the right thing, and I think that's why Spider-Man always wears his mask. You'll see sometimes he lifts it up off of his mouth, but he generally keeps his mask on like all the time.
And then he was always contemplating whether to reveal it to Liz Allen or Betty Brant.
Aunt May even.
And when it came into a pinch, just because, they wouldn't understand why he's always missing, why his timing's all off, and why he's always making up these excuses, why he can't go on these trips and spend time with more of them, because he's being a superhero. He picked up the photography job because, he's seen at the Daily Bugle as a way to make money, because, they still had to, Stanley still had to figure out like, how is he, if he's going to be an everyday person, how's he going to make money? How's he
fitting into society?
Like, yes, he's high school and everything, but I'm sure, people had like Paperboy and all that.
He has these powers, but how can he actually pay his bills?
Right. he used the last of his savings to buy a camera, and then, and he did that.
Yeah. And the other really great part is Peter Parker still values Aunt May and he values his family, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's part of why he doesn't take his mask off, because in a flip side, if you want to play devil's advocate, maybe he doesn't take his mask off because he doesn't want to be responsible for any blame.
Yeah. Oh, right. When everybody's blaming Spider-Man for any of these mistakes, he didn't beat the villain the first time.
Yeah.
So, that's why, Jameson, he's going to go right for that. And he's always searching for that angle as how did he mess up?
Or
he doesn't really celebrate success very much for Spider-Man.
Yeah. And that original thief that slipped past and eventually was the reason why Uncle Ben died. I think Spider-Man realizes that no one knows that he met that thief, that he
Yeah.
let him go, right? That to me is like the big secret.
Mm-hmm.
The big secret is not that he's Spider-Man. I think he hasn't told anyone, I'm the reason why Uncle Ben died. Now, I
Yeah.
don't even think he told Aunt May
Yeah.
that
Right.
ever.
No, I don't think so.
I mean, I've read a lot of Spider-Man through the years, and that's probably his biggest secret, is that he is ultimately responsible for Uncle Ben dying. And, you think about some of the other superheroes that have been built from tragedy. Batman, of course, first one. But little kid Bruce Wayne had no say and no part in that tragedy in the alley. But Spider-Man had a direct hand in
Yeah,
that.
that's very true. Yeah.
And I don't think that's just Stan Lee writing to make him a tragic character. I think that's Stan Lee writing to say, this could happen to you, reader, if you just stand by and let evildoers go.
Yeah.
If you let villainy happen.
Still trying to
everywhere.
reach kids and educate people still
Yeah.
and say, do the right thing, more or less.
And that's the big part of Spider-Man 2. It ultimately ends up with do the right thing, even though everyone hates you.
Right? Your life is going to be a hard one. We're not going to lie. It's going to be a hard one.
Even though that the kids at school will make fun of you. Do the
Girls
right
gonna be
thing.
hard, it's gonna be rough. Social relationships, forget them. But do your best, do your thing.
And then when you get towards the end of the omnibus, you start seeing Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, I think, working well together. But Steve Ditko was pretty well known for being very black and white. And I'm not sure if Steve Ditko really enjoyed the Marvel method, because I'm sure that as an artist, he was happy with his work, happy with his characters. But there's no way, as an artist, in my opinion, that you could be drawing these characters and not putting dialogue in your own mind while you're drawing these characters, jumping out of windows or grabbing people off the street or,
it's very fantastic things.
Yes. I mean, there has to be some dialogue. And Steve Ditko wanted every villain to have a story, like a real story, like why are you the way you are and why are you doing the things you're doing?
Some of them kind of range all over the place for he really dug deep, or it's kind of simplified.
But I don't think any of his villains were just like, I just want some money today and I'm not going to be a villain the rest of my life.
Especially when we're talking about like the Sinister Six, those are like iconic characters, iconic villains that still are used to this day. Yeah,
right. And that just, I think, came of it as Spider-Man realizing that these stories of him versus one villain were, I don't know, already sort of preordained as him winning. So then they decided, well, why don't we take his 6 top villains and make them all fight him at the same time?
Right. And I don't think were a lot of other comics doing that at the time.
No, I think he, aside from Batman, but we're not. Let's stop jumping DC Marvel, I suppose. But in Marvel Comics, I think Spider-Man was the first one to put together a rogues gallery.
Right. Yes. That's
villains.
A team up, a villain team up.
Yeah, and the Fantastic Four had threats, but the Fantastic Four fought universal threats.
Yeah.
Earth
shattering,
universe ending,
bigger than life events.
Cosmic threats. Ones that no one would see or notice or be able to fight.
Thor, same deal. They're gods. And they didn't really click together so much. They're in the same place, but that's about it.
So I think Spider-Man started putting together this group of villains that were over the top a little bit, right?
Yep.
But at the same time, they each had their own story and their own values of like, why are we villains? Why are we doing this? And it wasn't always just like, I like hurting people. That's like a Joker's answer, right?
Mhm.
But I think that a lot of the villains were mostly put together because Steve Ditko had a real story with each villain. And then I think when Stan Lee went in there and kind of wrote his own dialogue around that, that's kind of when him and Steve started not getting along. And it's pretty common lore in the comic industry that Steve Ditko and Stan Lee just eventually could not agree on anything. And Stan wanted to introduce villains that were friends of Peter Parker's, and he wanted to introduce villains that were like well known to each other. And Steve Ditko did not like the idea of a villain like hiding who he was.
Yeah.
It was like a big thing for him.
Right.
So if you're going to be a villain, then you're going to be a villain like all the time. And Stan Lee wanted to take the Green Goblin in a direction, and Steve Ditko did not agree with that.
Right. Which is really surprising considering, how big of the Green Goblin is these days and how big Norman Osborn and his whole family is and featured. So it's very cool like to see that retrospect.
Yeah. I mean, and that was sort of the last few issues was the Green Goblin and just a handful of other
Right.
kind
it was
side
cool when like the Green Goblin was introduced and when the Crime Master was introduced.
Yeah.
And it was like, oh, is this Crime Master going to become a Green Goblin? No, he's an entirely different thing. And then the Green Goblin's just this guy who's in the shadows, but he's still doing similar things. And so I think they're kind of like taking values from each other and kind of doing that. And another thing I also, when we're talking about villains, is how much the mob was involved.
Right.
And how like gangsters in the mob were involved. It was like, wait, Doc Ock had like his own mob. The Green Goblin hired his own like gang. Okay.
I think, well, and I think that was part of probably Stan Lee looking at what really was a relatable villain group at the time that people could say, oh, well, there's the mob. I mean, they're real.
And like one of the notable like mob groups was the Enforcers.
Yes.
Yeah. And they just, we thought they're beat. They just come back another issue. And they don't really have any special powers. They just have good talents.
They're like, silly teenage boy, you can't stop the mob.
Right.
You're just Spider-Man. You can go fight someone else. But yeah, so at the end of this, we're getting down to like Amazing Spider-Man number 33, 34, 35. Those became some classic Steve Ditko stories. Amazing Spider-Man number 33, it's called The Final Chapter, is like by far probably Steve Ditko's like crowning issue of artwork and drama and just claustrophobic. I mean, Spider-Man is buried pretty much under a building, and it's really great art. It's really great story. And even Stan Lee said, I just told Steve Ditko, let's draw Spider-Man trapped for like half the issue.
Yeah.
And that's what he came up with. So that's just one of the gems in this omnibus that if you are looking to collect some of the earlier Spider-Mans, you're going to notice that a lot of these issues are ones that people talk about. And here you can read them back to back and in order. And you can really see how the artists evolved, and you can see how the story evolved, and you can see how the character of Spider-Man takes shape. Finally, till we get to the end of this issue, which isn't much of a spoiler alert, but the Green Goblin was about to be revealed as Norman Osborn, the father of Peter Parker's best friend, Harry Osborn. And Stan Lee wanted to tell that story. He wanted the villain to be someone that was close to Peter. And Steve Ditko thought that was crazy. He said, no way, I'm not drawing it. And that was the linchpin in quite a few disagreements. And Steve Ditko ended up leaving the incredibly successful run of the Amazing Spider-Man. Steve Ditko stood up for himself and said, "That is not how I believe a villain would act, and that's not how I believe a villain should be revealed." And they ended, his last issue was Amazing Spider-Man number 38. And of course, Amazing Spider-Man number 39 started John Romita Jr. No, John Romita Sr. The dad.
Yep.
And that is the Amazing Spider-Man Omnibus Volume 2,
Yes.
the beginning.
Eventually, I will own it one day.
I have that one.
Yeah.
See, now we can just keep trading off tit for tat.
Yeah.
I have that. I don't have that. But yes, great volume. Really, definitely a must-have for any comic fan, any collector, anyone who feels like they want to know how all of this began.
Yeah. I mean, you'll see that in the movies, some scenes of how they were influenced, especially that notable issue of Spider-Man 33. They kind of had that influence on the latest Far From Home, Spider-Man Far From Home from Tom Holland, I believe. And so you'll pick out these scenes like, oh, I see that. That was cool. I kind of seen that appearance, like the Tobey Maguire, Spider-Man, how they did the origin story. Like you can pick out those moments that you're like, oh, that was it.
Yeah. And even some of the movies, they'll do poses. Like when Spider-Man's swinging through the city, they'll like sort of get him up to a pose and pause for just a second.
Yep.
And a lot of those are really iconic drawings, covers, and things like that for that. Speaking of covers, we should talk a little bit about Jack Kirby.
Okay.
Jack Kirby actually was Stan Lee's right-hand man. And of course, Jack and Stan were like the dynamic duo of Marvel Comics. Yes. And Stan Lee knew that the covers of the comic books, the artwork had to be really spectacular. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Because back in this time when these were sold, there weren't really comic shops.
Right, just the newspaper stand.
Yeah, newspaper stands, or just regular little tiny grocery stores, right. Spinner racks and stuff. So kids never really had a chance to talk to anyone who was really well versed in comics. I mean, if you think about it, comics themselves, this age, this was 2-3 years old. So unless you were at the newsstand and while you were handing out Time magazine and newspapers, you would say, oh, by the way, I read the last Spider-Man. Kids and adults had to base their entire purchasing power on the cover of the comic.
Right. So the cover had really sell all the action and the mystery and what was going to happen.
And that's why there's cover artists. There are literally artists who are just, I'm a cover artist, because they know how to make a splash page. They know how to make a really interactive cover where you would say, I will buy that issue based on that cover. And the other fun thing is that the covers still kept a lot of text on them, a lot of dialogue. And that's like an old school trick. If you look at like really old Supermans and really old Batmans, and even if we're going to stay Marvel, sorry, Marvel, really old, like Fantastic Four, they always had big blocks of text on there. Yes. I mean, Amazing Spider-Man number 9 is like really notorious for that. There's all sorts of a scene you will never forget.
Right. Or I like, on the Spider-Man number 1, the Fantastic Four think I'm trapped, but they don't suspect my real power.
Yeah.
Two great feature-length Spider-Man thrillers.
Literally Spider-Man saying a word.
Spider-Man meets the Fantastic Four as the chameleon strikes.
Yes. And they're always putting on, I mean, that was Stan Lee too, but they're always putting on like another spectacular smash hit.
Yep.
So you had to put something to catch the readers, and the covers, most of the early covers, I think later on Steve Ditko did all of them, but most of the early covers were done by Jack Kirby. Just because Stan Lee knew he could make a great cover, knew that he could make a really catchy layout, and then he would give it to Steve Ditko, the pencils, and he would say, here, Steve, you can ink these. Yeah. So a lot of times he'd get the pencils from Jack Kirby, and then Steve Ditko would do his own inking over the top of it, or just kind of redraw it. And so you can see pieces that are obviously Steve Ditko inspired, um, but that was kind of a sales spot. It's like a billboard, and it was really important for them to make sure that that was really catchy, that it kind of played the entire issue up. A lot of times the covers never were in the issue. Like that scene never happened.
Yep. Right. Just like a movie trailer. You might not see every scene in that movie trailer. It's just there to sell the movie.
Yeah. Or I guess, modern books, if you look at like a book cover for just a novel,
yep,
a lot of those scenes aren't actually in the book.
Yeah.
Or some of them are.
Pretty.
Yeah. It's pretty to catch your eye, to buy this issue.
Yep.
And then by the time, you get halfway through the run, even the price of the comic, they had one of the annuals in here is 25 cents, which at the time, probably, that was what? So that's $1.50.
Probably. Yeah.
It went up another third of the price. And I really just think that this is just such a great way to think of Spider-Man and really pay homage to the great Stan Lee, who passed away, and Steve Ditko, who passed away recently.
Recently. About a year ago. Yeah.
So
I still can't get over these splash pages.
Yeah.
When he starts doing them, he does them really well.
Yeah, full page artwork is what is really, you're kind of reading through, and then you turn the page and it's a full page art. That is why some of these old comics now, if you look at some of the other collectors too, like if you want to start collecting original artwork, or if you want to start collecting key issues, sometimes they don't have the whole issue all together. Like you could buy a first appearance, Fantastic Four, first appearance Batman, or things like that. You could buy just one page out of those now, and people are selling those. So of course, if you can get a splash page, or you can get some original artwork, from these first days, sometimes those are even more valuable because those are direct connections to the artist. Sometimes those, in my mind, I think those are more valuable than some of the issues because, if you think of an issue, it's mass printed and distributed, and somehow it has survived 60 years of being folded in some kid's pocket, or read on the playground, or, passed on from adult to kid. But the original artwork is like a direct connection to that artist. And I think having some original artwork from Jack Kirby or Steve Ditko,
all the pencils and inkers,
you
don't even need, it doesn't even need color.
No.
Those are usually all black and white, or pencils and inks, and that's it. But there's so much detail and creativity that just went into those, and it's so impressive and just shocking.
And you think about the pencils, and then what they did was they inked them and then they colored them.
Yeah.
Now, the fun part of Spider-Man is his coloring. If you think of just the straight up coloring of really most superheroes, he's red and blue. That's it. Red and blue, right?
Yep.
And then the color of almost every villain that he's fighting is
the opposite.
Green.
Yeah, green.
So you have red versus green, complementary colors.
Yeah, Sandman green, Electro green.
Yeah, I mean,
Chameleon had some green.
It's like, wait a minute, Dr. Octopus has a green outfit
Even Dr.
too.
Doom appears in this for a little bit. It's green.
And J. Jonah Jameson's
Green
always
Goblin.
wearing a green suit.
Yeah.
So it, in a subconscious kind of artistic layout way, is you have your hero, which is red and blue, red and blue, red and blue, and he starts coming up against everyone that's in green. And
that's really interesting to think about.
Yeah, it helps them fight. I mean, you're fighting villain and superhero, you know which one is which, and it helps them jump and pop out. I mean, even the original, what is this, Scorpion? He's all green.
Yeah, green, yeah. What I thought was interesting that
Green
I've
Goblin.
seen briefly in the back was when he wanted to show that Peter Parker was mad, he did him in all red.
Oh, yeah.
I got a snapshot of that. I'm like, that's really weird. Like you don't see that anymore, I guess. And
he changed like the whole background too.
yeah, a whole background, like a solid red almost.
A lot of the coloring,
just to show like express anger. I was like, did he do that on purpose, or was that a printing thing, or is just the colorist just like, I'll do that?
Heck yeah, he did that on purpose.
I'm like, okay. That, as you read on, you're like, oh, okay, yeah, this is kind of his thing. That's how he wanted to do it.
Well, and the Fantastic Four is all blue outfits too.
Yep.
So, that part of it is what, as an artist and as people who are looking at this as a form of pop culture and a form of art history, each page is meant to lay out and move your eye through the panels. Everyone always says, if you're newer to comics, well, how do you read the comics? Which order do you go? And sometimes it gets tricky, like wonky layouts, right? But in these sort of earlier printings, you knew that you had to go, one full row, next full row, next full row, right?
Yep. Oh, the paneling.
Yeah. So when the art sort of breaks that panel, or when the artwork leads your eye without you thinking about it, that's when you know that the page is done right. Mm-hmm. And that was one thing that Steve Ditko really did well, was move you through one scene to the next and keep the momentum going, like, so you weren't lost in the story, and you become caught up in the story. And before you know it, you are placing yourself in that scene. You are all of a sudden right there with Spider-Man, tumbling around and fighting the characters, because they drew it realistic enough. I mean, if you step back from it, you're like, okay, that's a drawing, right? But they drew it realistic enough that you are caught up in the action of it. And then you're caught up in the story of it. And then you're wondering, when you turn the page, what's the next start? Because that's kind of the mentality of the comic pages, is you go like 2 or 3 pages and then there's a reveal. And then 2 or 3 pages and there's a break.
That makes sense.
2 or 3 pages and then there's like a drama climax thing. Mm-hmm. So they kind of make sure that you are like, oh, someone's sneaking up on them. And then when you turn the page, wow, there they are.
Yep. Or on the end on the cliffhanger. So you have to get
yes.
That's the thing that is interesting when you hear people talking about omnis and like the old Silver Age stuff. They're like, well, back in the day, like the Silver Age, they were doing it by singles. Like sometimes it wasn't just like you had to read the next one. They were trying to sell it to like self-contain it a bit. Mm-hmm. But then, some of these, like, you can't really do that. Like, he's going to go fight the next villain. They kind of did that towards the end of it, of the Omni. So I like having this whole run together. Yeah. Because I don't think reading in singles, that would have been, especially like, today when I read singles, if I miss an issue, you might not, join the two thinkings together, especially as he evolves.
Yeah, the story breaks, and then you feel like you're disjointed. You feel like you're watching a movie and you paused it for 10 minutes and you're going back into it. They kind of played on that a little bit in the 90s, where they made a ton of crossovers, and one run was 10 different titles and you had to jump around.
They kind of exploited that.
Yeah, they exploited that because they wanted you to buy all the titles, because before they knew it, Marvel Comics had like 20 titles going, where at this time there were 4 or 5, and actually there's some ads in here promoting the Daredevil.
Yep.
Daredevil number 1 coming out.
It makes an appearance in here.
Yep. And then they're also promoting like the Incredible Hulk coming up, and the original X-Men in the 60s kind of started, and that was a direct connection to the teenage Spider-Man also becoming teenage X-Men. And I think once Stan realized that the teenagers are the ones who are telling their parents, I need this comic, well, then I think that was the great the great connection to say, all right, teenagers, let's start reading this. And then, now, of course, all the teenagers are growing up. But great connection at the point, at the time. What's our time? About 58 minutes. Oh my gosh. Andrew, you have to do some sort of closer.
All right. So this omnibus that collects Amazing Fantasy number 15 through Amazing Spider-Man 38, it was incredible. It's definitely, you get to see and grow up with and see how the character evolves with Spider-Man. He grows up, he graduates high school, he goes through all these problems, he takes care of Aunt May and her ups and downs of getting old, facing off the villain of the week, but these villains keep coming back. He has to struggle with that. He also has to face like Doctor Doom. He had like the guest of the week, Daredevil comes in, Doctor Strange, all these characters make an appearance. And this is, I guess the Fantastic Four were like the first family, and they did their share of like crossovers and appearances. But this was kind of like the start of like a lot of these cameos coming in and building up. I mean, we talked about Spider-Man having this fantastic rogues gallery that are so iconic. Like they continue to put them in the movies. They really, yes, they have evolved, and maybe they'll make their intentions more realistic. But this is fantastic, how they kind of build these regular people up to these fantastic and surreal villains. You also see like some iconic moments and things like that just they'll change, how we think of comics today. And then you also like become sympathetic with characters such as like the Lizard, who is a family man that science experimented wrong, kind of like Spider-Man, but he came this more like he couldn't control himself as a villain, which was like just like to see like that happen was really cool. And then Steve Ditko, yes, he it's kind of simplistic today in today's standards, but he did some really iconic things and was very big like pioneer as far as the style of Spider-Man. He made these great villains. Yes, like Jack Kirby was kind of in the background doing some covers, but really it was like a lot of his ideas that kind of formulated this. And with Stan Lee's ability to tell the story and make it relatable, something that only he could do. And yeah, they disagreed on some things, especially towards the end, but I think they really had a good momentum for this character. And just to bring this to like make it relatable to people across the world and America was really spectacular. And so I think I really enjoyed this read. It was cool. And it made me relate to this character even more, and kind of grew a better understanding of what Spider-Man is.
So we hope you enjoyed our Bam Pow Comics Hour, and we will be discussing a new omnibus or a new storyline in future podcasts. And we hope to hear from you in the comments section, or just look forward to our next podcast. This is Chris Ramos signing off.
This is Andrew Gallagher signing off.
Thank
Bam
you.
Pow.
Thank you.